Welcome to the Why Factor, a chance to work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Make yourself comfortable, my friend.
So I'm sitting in a barber's chair with James, and he's a big lad, and he's got a few tattoos, and so he's going to be holding a cutthroat razor next to my neck while I ask him about his masculinity. Does anyone think this is a good idea?
That's right. Be nice.
Yes, say ever more men. It is a vital idea. Even the big tattooed barber says so. You're listening to The Why Factor on the BBC World Service with me, Michael Blastland, which this week asks, why do we need to talk about men?
I'm kind of forcing people to talk. I'll force you to talk in a minute when I get my razor to your throat.
The usual reason for talking about men is this one.
When the news broadcaster comes on at the beginning of the news, they should just introduce it by let's see what men have got up to today.
Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein appears in court in New York, charged with rape and sexual abuse.
And we are coming back on the air right now with more on that horrifying night in Paris. Police have now confirmed at least 4 attacks in the city of Paris tonight.
The vast majority of crime, a lot of the kind of unpleasantness that we experience in our daily lives is down at some level to kind of unchecked sort of microaggressions of masculinity.
That's Grayson Perry, a renowned artist, writer, filmmaker, and with a recent book and TV series about men fascinated by masculinity. Just think of men in traffic, he says, where it's as if they're marking territory.
Whenever a young man comes past me blasting his stereo out of his car, I always think, that's just, I am here, listen to me.
We could go on about the wrongs men do, but no. Because, as Grayson Perry also says, it's not as simple as just calling them out. The problem, and this is our focus, is that there's far more to men than just being the bad guys.
Are they victims or villains, or are they both?
They're both. The people who police masculinity are other men. They're the prison guards and the prisoners at once. You know, it can be like, the men, they're doing this, so therefore they are bad. But no, they're victims of it as well. Who's the most likely person to get beaten up in the street? A young man. And of course it'll be by another young man. I think there needs to be empathy for people who are trapped in masculinity.
Trapped in masculinity? Interesting word. What does it mean here? That some men want to talk about men for their sake, worrying that an old ideal makes their lives worse. That men in a men's world might not be having it all their own way is an idea some women begin to share. Rebecca Asher is a feminist writer whose views have shifted.
The first book that I wrote was about the experience of becoming a mother and about illusions of equality which became shattered, essentially, on becoming mothers. And I went into that book, I think it's fair to say, feeling pretty aggrieved as a woman and fairly hostile towards men collectively.
But after speaking to a lot of men about fatherhood,
I began to realise that they don't come out sort of winning and smiling either. They lose things, they have disappointments. They wanted to be different fathers or better fathers than the fathers that they had had. That was something that they measured themselves by a lot.
I'm interested that it was a surprise.
Yeah, I think it was hand on heart. I was quite cross when I went into writing that book. I had very definite views about what was going on there, and I had to, I think, be honest with myself that it wasn't quite as sort of simple and straightforward as that there was another side to this story.
No, men are not all cartoon villains or heroes, come to that. A cartoon version does exist, but often he's in our heads. If you like him, this cartoon man, he's tough and dominant. He's a winner. If you don't, he's lazy, privileged, maybe a thug or oppressor. But the other side of the story is that men are, who'd have thought, often more complicated than that. Yet, we find ourselves herded by clichés about how we should behave, boxed in by expectations that hurt others and us.
We looked at what we called the man box.
Gary Barker, who more than 20 years ago helped set up Pro Mundo, an organisation that helps men and boys talk about masculinity. Pro Mundo has surveyed men in the UK, US, in Mexico, Jamaica, Australia, in an attempt to find out just what is in this man box. His conclusion? A set of views about manhood, rigid views such as:
you don't seek help, you use force if necessary to get your way. You don't reach out to others when you feel vulnerable. You've got to be the one in charge. 40 to 50% of young men believe in those things.
So what happens to them?
The guys who believe in those things are 2 to 3 times more likely to use violence against others, whether it's harassment online or in the physical world, whether it's bullying. They're about 4 or 5 times more likely to be depressed. They're several times more likely to experience or to have thought about suicide. And we know in other studies, not just ours, that same association.
When men are dying from their masculinity, maybe a man's world isn't so straightforward. To understand how it goes wrong for men, we'll begin at the beginning, in childhood, which is where we take up the story of James Mace, the barber.
Would you like to keep your sideburns along? Or do you want me to bring them high up? Or
James is 36 now and still remembers his first lessons in how to be a man.
I do remember conversations of times being upset and being told not to cry. Come on, don't cry, no need to cry, big boys don't cry. So those sort of things kind of, I guess, drilled into me from a young age. It was the fear of people taking the mickey out of you for being a big girl's blouse, being a bit of a wuss, all that sort of thing.
Taking the mickey, a wuss, strange English phrases, but you know they mean a hard time. From a British upbringing to Texas in the United States, where Gary Barker grew up, these kind of bruising male experiences are all in that man box.
I was taken from Southern California to Texas when I was a 10-year-old, and the world of, the beach and playing at being a surfer to pickup trucks and cowboy boots was a bit of a shock.
Do you think it's fair to trace your beliefs now back to that early experience?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in that same school experience a few years later, I witnessed a school shooting in my high school cafeteria, which, the scripts are still the same in terms of a young man with a gun. In this case, it was not an automatic weapon. He killed another student in supposedly a fight over a girlfriend. Watching how the school reacted, particularly how we as boys and young men reacted to that, of just kind of in denial. Whereas girls expressed solidarity with others, they cried, they talked about it, we kind of bottled it up. And I remember thinking, without having the words of talking about this as masculinity, but just it was masculinity among many other things.
The older men, the only emotion they would express was the emotion of anger.
Derek Owusu, writer and podcast host, a Ghanaian growing up in London.
So seeing my dad, my uncles and all those kind of things, how aggressive they were, that they were angry all the time, never seeing them smile.
From father to son, is this how our ideas take shape of what it means to be a man?
Because then obviously in a lot of countries in Africa, the culture is that your child is not your friend. Your child is not your classmate. You're their parent. You're there to make sure they get the best out of their life. That's it. You don't need to be friends with them. Which I understand. But at the same time, you being completely emotionally closed off to your child is going to have a psychological effect on them.
As the years pass, the rules of masculinity are laid down, building tensions for later in life, just as they did for James, the barber.
And my first proper job was on a building site, labouring, so in a very manly, masculine environment,
What did that mean?
think it was just a case of being one of the lads, you know. It was like how you dressed, how you spoke, not making fun of other people because you didn't want that person to be you and then them to start landing to you. And we'd all go to like the pub together, and it would be a case of peer pressure. You've got 2 drinks in front of you, you've got 2 pints, come on, speed up, get that one down, so you've got to neck that one and
the abuse if you didn't.
And the abuse if you didn't.
All men are kind of jostling secretly with each other.
Intimidation, says Grayson Perry. It becomes part of the act as you try to make your way in life. Put others in their place as they put you in yours. It's all in the box.
In whatever milieu you happen to be in, you know, making radio documentaries or an artist, the other people are all kind of sniffing you constantly. And in every group has what I call a version of the dog sniffing conversation. And I'm sure, you know, it's like, what are you making a documentary about at the moment? Oh, hi. And well, who's that for? Okay, and what's the list of figures on that? And what's your budget? You know, all those things. That sniff. How important are you? How successful are you? You know,
working out the pecking order.
Yeah, totally, all the time. 2 cyclists, mate, come far. You know, it's there, straight up, right in your face.
Everyone trying to stand a little taller to be the man. And maybe even more so, says Derek Asuwu, if you bear the legacy of slavery. And what's written on your box is black masculinity.
When people have been subjugated for so long and there's been a boot on their neck, once they stand up straight, they're going to feel like they need to prove themselves a lot more than somebody else. You know, one thing that I was really passionate about, I used to read about a lot, was, you know, how HIV is spreading in East Africa because of a lot of men are so masculine that they feel like they're so much men that it's an insult for their wife to ask them to use a condom, even though they are sleeping around. You know, the wives are scared to ask them because they might get a beating or something like that.
This kind of masculinity, he says,
it's a joke. If I come across anybody who's like considers themselves an alpha male, I feel bad for them. Do you know what I mean? I don't get angry at them. I just feel like, oh man, I feel sorry for you. I would like to have a conversation with you and see what's really going on. Why do you feel like you need to put on a show? I mean, we all put on a show to a certain extent. All of us, we're all actors. But other people believe in the act to the point where they actually believe it's them. I think that's dangerous.
One problem, though, is that some men do believe it and don't see any danger. Men who might come through life feeling tall, feeling good, asserting power, suits them just fine.
Some guys who are more in the box also felt happier, and in some ways they're living up to, you know, what others expect around them.
Gary Barker from Pro Mundo.
And that's the contradiction of it, right? It both brings us a sense of kind of an easy-to-grab onto identity, and for some guys who feel like they're succeeding with it, but we also find that it comes at a cost.
A cost to others and a risk to them. Because if you're not ruling the roost, if you don't conform, don't like the compromisers, what then? Or if at some point things fall apart, as they did for James the barber.
Life got difficult for me in my late 20s when I lost my mum. And then unfortunately 6 months later, I lost my 10-year-old nephew, very out of the blue, to a brain aneurysm. Losing 2 very, very close family members was a massive trauma, massive shock.
How did you deal with it?
Well, I didn't know how to deal with it. A lot of alcohol, I'd say, as a coping mechanism. But I didn't talk, that's for sure. I didn't talk, and I found it difficult to be myself, especially in front of my family, because I wanted to be strong.
The old thing coming back again.
That's right, yeah. I wanted to be the strong one.
The one who doesn't cry.
That's right.
The big boy.
If they wanted to cry, I wanted to be that shoulder for them to cry on. Then when I was on my own, then that's when I'd be like, okay, I'm really, really bloody struggling now.
At that point, the idea that this man's world can also be a trap makes more sense. And there are other costs, the cost of neglected friendship. In research for her second book, Man Up, Rebecca Asher says men told her that from senior school on, friendships often became stilted and eventually might seize up. An American book called Dude, You're a Fag tells us why, she says.
Intimate, emotionally open behaviour is deemed gay. So boys refrain from that. They withdraw from their friendships. And then when they get into couples, if they're heterosexual and they have relationships with women, what tends to happen, and certainly once they have children, is that the friendships tend to be sort of organised and mediated through the female partner. So lots of the men that I spoke to talked about essentially kind of giving up on sort of managing their own social life.
Where does that all end?
You know, if your wife, partner dies and they've been the person, the social glue really, or you get divorced, that you can end up very lonely.
It all falls apart. Things Fall Apart is the title of a book by Chinua Achebe about a man who masters feeling with his fists. You can guess how that ends. So, if we want to change the story for men, how do we do it? A first step is to take care how we tell it.
How many men want to come in a room if you say, hey, let's question masculinity? There's not a lot of men at the bar. Yeah, I'm going with him. I want to do that. But if we talk about, how's your life going with you? How's that manhood going for you? That's when we see when the armor begins to crack.
So that's one step. Think about how we sell the idea of change.
We're seeing a huge amount of defensiveness with men, and I think because whether we use the term patriarchy or toxic masculinity, it often feels like you, the person saying that, thinks that all men are bad. Yes, we need to call out some men, absolutely, and we need to keep doing that part. But the other part is to say, this is about how we're raised. This is how we raise our sons, because we've also learned how to nurture, and we've also been cared for, and we know what deep love and passion are like. I think that's the conversation around saying we get better if you buy into these traits, not that we think all men are bad.
Another step is to say more often that masculinity is not defined only by the men who hog the attention. Remember how Gary Barker said surveys found 40 to 50% of men agreed with rigid values in what he called the man box? That means 50 to 60% didn't. Different is fine, says Grayson Perry.
When we look at the masculine flag bearers, are those really most men?
No, they're not. They're kind of a weird extreme. And of course, social media has made it so that those sort of people are so much more visible in all fields, not just in masculinity. I can be very guilty sometimes of sort of painting a quite gloomy picture of masculinity because, in a way, it's very difficult to sell the good side of it. But I think that, what we see often, what snags on our consciousness are the extremes.
Grayson Perry rides a motorbike, a mountain bike, on which he takes serious risks. He's competitive.
Very successful artist.
Has a wife and gets off, as he puts it, by wearing a dress.
I'm a transvestite, so I like to dress up.
Like I said, complicated. But, whatever. In other words, this isn't blame, it's escape. Of course, not everyone finds that easy. Not when the prison guards are other men and women. But, believe it or not, I can manage outside the box too, says Gary Barker, recalling when he looked after the kids while his wife was the main breadwinner.
The pediatrician who looked at you as, would you pass this information to the mother? And I thought, I'm kind of competent. I can remember these, what I should be doing with my daughter here. The world looking at me, the number of women who came up to me, and I thought I had written on my forehead, incompetent parent, please take this small child from this man's arms. So, yeah, I've, a bit of provocation in that to say less Homer Simpson and more, involved LeBron James kind of, hands-on dads who can get this. We're actually wise enough as male human beings to figure out how to care for young children.
Could change be the making of men?
What they don't realise is it's got a huge upside, which I've experienced myself, which is, emotional intelligence, if you would call it, or emotional awareness, leads you to being more in control of your feelings and your relationships, and it gives you a much richer experience of the world.
Life for James Mace did fall apart. He staggered out of his old job one day, desperate, straight to a doctor, and finally talked properly.
That was the first step that I took to a recovery and positivity, really.
Slowly, life improved.
Once I started actually talking and opening up, then things started becoming a bit easier. Little baby steps, taking a bit of control back in my life.
So if this is really liberating, not about stopping men being men, can we still do the old stuff? Take risks? Revel in physical strength, all that?
Yes, that's completely allowed.
Oh, yeah, it's a leisure activity, fine. Just don't bring it to the office, or into the house.
Take your boots off, leave them on the mat.
Like your rugby boots, just leave them on the step.
My point is that they should be allowed to do other stuff too, and that equally girls and women should be allowed to be competitive and physical and vocal. That's something that everybody should be able to kind of revel in the right place.
I don't want to take anything away from men. Playing through, the adversity or whatever, those are all good things. Those don't necessarily have to be bad things. I think it's about saying you can also be nurturing and empathetic and connected in deep ways to your mate and showing him or her that.
So is it for you a kind of freedom?
Absolutely.
Back in the barber's shop, James Mace takes care of his customers in more ways than one. He runs meetings for men, is an ambassador for a men's health movement.
And now I'm looking around the barber shop and there are posters on the wall that say 5 things worth knowing about men's health.
Yeah.
So number 1 says make man time, stay connected. Spending time with your friends is good for you, catch up regularly. Has this become part of your life now?
Absolutely.
Well, we talked about men, all right. Nearly an hour later in the chair, most of the beard gone, we finally get down to the cutthroat razor.
Hopefully you're going to find it relaxing as well. With the steamer on you as well, the hot steamer, that's opening up your pores.
Is it time for us all to open up just a little? The Y Factor was produced by Anna Meisel and presented by me, Michael Blastland. The editor was Andy Smith and it was studio produced by Neil Churchill. You can hear more by subscribing to our podcast.
And whilst you're there and your mouth is covered up, you can't talk, so I'm going to ask you what you do for your mental health.
Hi, I'm Kalki Kekla. I'm a Bollywood actor and, of course, a podcast presenter. And I'm back for another season of My Indian Life. For our second season, I've been traveling all over this huge country.
Everything came crashing down because this was the only thing we had left in Kashmir. I felt like I didn't belong in Delhi.
Talking to a wide range of people who all have something to say.
There is this old belief that anybody who's born with a genetic condition is the result of sin or a result of something that happened in your life in the past, and that's why there's a stigma attached to it.
All in the company of some really inspiring young Indians.
I think happiness is a mindset, not just an emotion. I can decide to be happy or I can decide to be sad.
That's Kalki presents My Indian Life from the BBC World Service.
This music is rogue. It really represents what's going on the ground level over here.
Just search for My Indian Life wherever you get your podcasts.